hands together for President Bukele!
El Salvador has changed forever, and we have demonstrated it here once again. It has been an honor to welcome the delegates, the organizers, the visitors from different countries. Miss Universe has given us the opportunity to show the world the country we are building. Welcome to El Salvador. Thank you very much.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about El Salvador. Now, at the start of today's video, you saw Nayib Bukele, the president, introducing the 2023 Miss Universe contest, which was held in El Salvador. And the start of today's video is in stark contrast to the last video that I posted on El Salvador, where I showed footage of tattooed gang members in boxer shorts being marched in handcuffs into the largest prison in the world. And in today's video, what I want to do is give you an update as to what's happening on the war on gangs in El Salvador, because it's still going on and they are still arresting tens of thousands of people, but things are starting to improve dramatically. We'll then talk about an interesting discussion that Nayib Bukele had with the leader of one of the biggest institutions in the world, where they were implying that actually closing down all of the gangs could actually be a bad thing for the economy of El Salvador. And we'll hear what he had to say about that. We'll then talk about the relationship with China, because China has El Salvador on its Belt and Road Initiative. It's looking to make large investments into the country, but Nayib Bukele is doing things differently. And we'll have a look at some footage of the National Library that was opened recently. I'll then provide you with my summary and conclusion as to where I think El Salvador is sitting right now and what's likely to happen over the next 12 to 24 months. And then we'll finish off today's video with some footage of that mega prison, because if you haven't seen that footage, you really do need to check it out. It is quite an incredible concept, and even if you have seen it, I'd suggest it's worth having another look. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that supported the channel. Really appreciate it. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a member or a patron, I really appreciate it. Thank you. Nayib Bukele has been focused on clearing up the gang culture in El Salvador for a long period of time. Back in 2015, at the age of 30, he was elected as the mayor of San Salvador, which is the capital of the country. And during his 4-year tenure, he cleaned up the streets of San Salvador, focusing in on all of those gangs. And in 2019, he ran for the presidency and put forward his war on gangs as one of his main policies, and was voted in with a majority of more than 90%. Now, over the last 4 years, he has changed the landscape in El Salvador. Prior to taking over as the president, El Salvador was classified as the most dangerous country in the world. This chart shows the countries with the highest murder rate between 2017 and 2021. And I've highlighted El Salvador at the bottom. And what this shows is that in 2017 and 2018, El Salvador had the highest murder rate in the world, with more than 63 deaths per 100,000 people in 2017 and 53 in 2018. Nayib Bukele took over the presidency in June 2019, and in that year El Salvador lost its #1 ranking to Jamaica, and the murder rate was down to 38 per 100,000. In 2020 it fell further to 21 per 100,000, and in 2021 the murder rate was down to 18, and that ranked El Salvador as only the 15th most dangerous country in the world. In order to tackle the huge problem with gangs, Nayib Bukele had two strategies. Firstly, he wanted to take those gang members off the streets. And secondly, he wanted to clean up the prison system, because historically the gang members were running the prisons. They were using the prisons as their offices and still controlling what was happening on the streets, because gang members were able to have access to all of their gangs and still coordinate all of their efforts. One of the first initiatives that Nayib Bukele undertook was to build a mega prison to hold all of these gangsters once they'd been arrested. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, if you haven't already seen that footage, I've attached it at the end of today's video. It's well worth checking out. It is an incredibly scary place, not somewhere you would ever want to find yourself unless you are a gang member, because you wouldn't survive more than 5 minutes. Once the construction of the mega prison was underway, Nayib Bukele set about clearing the streets of gangs. And in March 2022, he declared a state of emergency, which gave the police the power to arrest anybody on suspicion of either being a gang member or being involved in a crime. And the change in the laws led to literally tens of thousands of gangsters being arrested. And the latest count in December 2023 is that so far 73,000 people have been arrested and charged with being a gang member. Now, the population of El Salvador is actually only 6.3 million. So that means that the 73,000 people that were arrested account for more than 1% of the total population. Quite incredible. Now, one of the problems that El Salvador faced was actually being able to handle that amount of prisoners and court cases, because you can imagine that if you had to have an individual court case for every single person that's arrested, it would take a very long time and use up all of the state's resources and finances. So in order to combat that problem, Nayib Bukele introduced a new law allowing up to 900 people at a time to be trialled in the same case. Now, in terms of the mega prison itself, the last official figures that were released in June 2023 stated that 12,000 gang members had been located in the prison. However, given the continued high level of arrests, it's now estimated that the prison is holding around 40,000 gang members. Now, in order to accommodate up to 60,000 prisoners, which potentially this prison could hold, the cells have been designed to hold up to 100 prisoners each. So they are all held in the same pen, and there are no mattresses, only metal bunks, and only 2 toilets and 2 washing areas for 100 people. Now, whilst all of the prisoners are offered daily exercise, there are question marks as to whether or not they're allowed any access to the outside world, whether they're actually let outside of the building. And as a result of all of these conditions, there have been complaints from human rights groups saying that even though these people are gang members, they still have human rights and they should be afforded the right to go outside. They shouldn't be sharing a cell with 99 other people. They should be given a mattress, that they're not being given enough food, and that the conditions are inhumane. Now, these matters have all been put to Nayib Bukele, and his response to this has been really interesting.
Y no me importa lo que digan los organismos internacionales, que vengan a proteger a nuestra gente, que vengan a llevarse a sus pandilleros. Si tanto los quieren, se los entregamos todos al 2x1.
So Nayib Bukele has made it clear that he's focused on improving the living conditions for everybody else in El Salvador, and he's not really that concerned about how these gang members are treated in prison itself. And the results of this policy are clear to see, because El Salvador is no longer the murder capital of the world. Now, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, Nayib Bukele recently commented on a conversation that he had with the leader of one of the biggest multinational aid agencies in the world. Now, he decided not to disclose which agency it was from, but let's have a look at exactly how that conversation went. So Nayib Bukele said that he was talking with a multilateral agency. Now, he said he wouldn't say which one, but I know El Salvador are currently talking to the IMF about another loan, so it potentially could have been the IMF. And the representative from this organisation said, please be careful dealing with your war on gangs, because there is a gang economy. Now, Nayib Bukele was a bit surprised by this comment and asked him what did he mean. And the guy said, well, whether you like it or not, the gangs are their own dark economy. If there are 70,000 gang members, that's 70,000 jobs in inverted commas. That's what he said. Which means there are 70,000 households depending on those jobs. And these gangs maintain an illegal economy, trafficking drugs and weapons, committing extortion, homicides, and lots of other crimes. But they also underpin a legal economy. They buy mobile phone credit, motorcycles, beer, weapons, food for their families, television sets, entertainment, internet, and all that revenue is going to fail. And then there's another legal economy depending on these gangs, alarm companies, security agents, and if you remove that layer from the economy all at once, then El Salvador's GDP will drop. And in response to this, Nayib Bukele said, well, if that's what it takes, then that's what we'll do. If I was diagnosed with cancer and the treatment required surgery and chemotherapy, if my body had to take a hit, I would take it. I will be weak and bruised, I'll have an operation, I'll have chemotherapy, but I'll get rid of that cancer. And then I can recover and have a better life. That's what's going to happen for El Salvador. We're going to take an economic hit to stop crime, but then we'll get healthy and recover what we've lost and more, because the right incentives will be in place for society. Youth wouldn't be incentivized to steal or kill, or to say, why go to school when I can collect extortion? Why go to school when I can steal? Or why go to school when I can join a gang? And another youth felt that there was no point going to school if he was going to be mugged or harassed or even killed for refusing to join a gang. Women selling vegetables in the market saw no reason to grow their business if it just meant paying more extortion. If somebody bought a motorcycle, that would just raise extortion in their community or neighbourhood. If they bought a car, they would have to pay even more. There were no incentives for doing the right thing. All of the incentives were perverse. So by eliminating the gangs, we've turned those incentives around. Now stealing, killing, or being a gang member will land you in prison. But if you work, you won't have to pay extortion to grow your business. The vegetable vendors can buy more and expand their stalls. Women selling sandwiches can buy another grill and make more sandwiches, even hire some staff. Nobody's going to come to extort them at their place of business or in their communities for buying a motorcycle or a car, or for buying a television, or for wearing nicer clothes. Now we have the right incentives for our society. Youth no longer have incentives to join the gangs. I don't know how gangs will recruit people now. And despite the advice that we were given by that multilateral institution, we decided to go ahead with our war on gangs. And surprisingly, by the end of 2022, our GDP hadn't fallen. It has risen. It's climbed instead of falling. We eliminated that large swathe of the economy with those 70,000 jobs in inverted commas and those 70,000 households that depended on those illegal jobs, with all of that legal and illegal consumption and all of that lost revenue. Our GDP should have fallen, but it didn't. We avoided the fall. We cured the cancer without suffering the ravages of chemotherapy. If you follow the channel, you'll know that we've talked a lot about China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this was something that China introduced in 2013. China's plan was to provide finance to help poorer countries be able to develop its infrastructure to try and improve things like road, rail and air transport, and the provision of facilities such as power stations and national libraries. Now, interestingly, prior to Nayib Bukele becoming president of El Salvador actually recognised Taiwan, which wasn't something that China was very happy about. However, over the last 4 years, that position has changed, and El Salvador is now much closer to China. And as a result of that changed relationship, China has been investing into El Salvador to help develop its infrastructure. And one of the first initiatives that's now been completed in El Salvador is the opening of the National Library. And as you can see from this footage, this is an amazing building with amazing facilities. This is literally a state-of-the-art facility. You will struggle to see a national library that is better than El Salvador's. The building itself is an impressive 7-storey structure, and Nayib Bukele himself is involved in the design of these facilities. And each of the 7 floors are dedicated to a different form of learning. And the building itself is open 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, which I think makes it the first library in the world that is open 24/7. And the building itself is located in an area of the capital city that was previously abandoned and was labelled as a ghost town. So this is a genuine redevelopment of the area. And when the library was officially open to the public, there were enormous queues. Everybody wanted to pay a visit and see what the library had to offer. Now, as you might be aware, Nayib Bukele likes to be at the cutting edge of technology. He was one of the first adopters of Bitcoin. In 2021, El Salvador actually announced that Bitcoin has become legal tender in the country. It was the first country to do this. And rather than having a fireworks display, which is obviously old technology, Nayib Bukele decided that the National Library should have a drone display. So all of the images that you can see here are actually being projected by drones that are being flown above the library. Now, in terms of the cost and the financing, no details have officially been released, but it's been estimated that the library cost $54 million to build. And as I said at the start of this section, Nayib Bukele has stated that he is not taking loans from China, that these are investments that China is making into El Salvador to develop the relationship between the two countries further. And in addition to the National Library, Nayib Bukele recently announced that China is also now building a new national stadium for El Salvador, which will be used for all of its major sporting events. So what we're seeing here is a real development of the relationship between the two countries. But the big question is, how is this being financed? Is this genuinely free investment that China is providing to El Salvador, or are they really providing debt facilities in the same way as they've done in many other countries around the world? And if China has used debt, then it obviously raises the question as to what will happen if El Salvador fails to be able to meet the repayments or the interest on that debt. El Salvador's economy today is dominated by manufacturing. The majority of raw materials are imported. The country then manufactures and produced finished articles, a lot of it for the textiles industry, and then it's exported overseas. The biggest export market for El Salvador is the USA, after a free trade agreement was signed in 2004. However, these accomplishments have been offset by high oil prices, natural disasters, and a decline in the number of manufacturing plants. These factors have prevented El Salvador from paying off its external debt, and the country continues to rely partly on foreign aid. It's estimated that more than 1 million Salvadorians live in the United States and have played an increasingly important role in the Salvadorian economy since the end of the country's civil war, as they send back large amounts of cash every single month. This chart shows the quarterly movement in El Salvador's GDP dating back to the start of 2021. And as you can see, El Salvador has been producing positive growth in GDP in every one of the last 11 quarters. And the most recent figure for quarter 3 of 2023 is a more than healthy increase of 3.6%, which indicates that the economy is doing well. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation dating back to December 2022. And as you can see, inflation has reduced in every single one of the last 12 months. This time last year, inflation was running at 7.3%. However, today, it's down to 2.1%. And for most countries in the world, the target rate of inflation is somewhere in the region of 2%. And the current rate of inflation in El Salvador is significantly lower than it is in many advanced economies right now. This chart shows the balance of trade for El Salvador, which is basically the difference between the value of all of your exports and the cost of all of your imports. And as you can see, the balance of trade has been negative in every single one of the last 12 months. And this is as a result of the fact that El Salvador is a net importer. As we've just discussed, El Salvador's main exports are textiles, which are relatively low in value and profit. And it has to import fuel and food, which are expensive and mean that the country runs a negative balance of trade. And this chart shows the current account for El Salvador, which is basically like the bank account for the country. And as you can see, in every single quarter dating back to the start of 2021, El Salvador has been running a deficit on its current account, which means that it needs cash to be able to keep the country running. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to give you an update on what's happening with the mega prison, because the original video that I did on the mega prison was one of my most popular, so it's obviously struck a chord with a lot of viewers, so I thought I'd give you an update. And secondly, to talk about what's happening in El Salvador itself. Now, in terms of the prison, the last official figures that we had released by El Salvador, which was around 6 months ago, said that there were 12,000 prisoners. But the estimate today is that it's more like 40,000, which actually was the original capacity figure that was released by the authorities. However, a lot of estimates now are saying that it can house up to 60,000 people. Not sure how comfortably it will house those people, but I think the takeaway in terms of the war on gangs is that a lot of the gangsters have actually been taken off the streets and are now being housed in that prison itself. Now, the big question, I guess, is what happens when that prison hits capacity? Will El Salvador instruct the building of a second mega prison? Well, in terms of what's likely to happen in El Salvador, I can't see Nayib Bukele giving up in his war on gangs. So if he needs a second mega prison, I am sure that he will instruct the building of one. And it may well be that he asks the Chinese to help fund that mega prison if he does indeed need a second one. But in terms of what's happening on the streets of El Salvador, as we've seen from the data in today's video, the murder rate has dropped significantly. El Salvador used to be the most dangerous country in the world. It was #1 in the charts for many, many years. However, it is now down towards towards number 50, which represents a huge improvement for the people of El Salvador. And obviously, removing a lot of the gang members and putting them into prison has helped that significantly. And on that point, a human rights organisation recently announced that they believe that 174 of the prisoners have actually died in prison. No details have actually been released as to how those prisoners died, but in terms of the official murder rate on the streets of El Salvador, it's gone down significantly. And as we saw from the economic data, GDP is now on the rise in El Salvador, and inflation is much lower than it is in many developed countries around the world. So the economy is actually doing okay. However, El Salvador remains a net importer. It has to buy in expensive items such as fuel, and as we saw from the balance of trade, it's running a deficit and therefore continues to need debt facilities. Now, many other countries that find themselves in these situations have been turning to China over the last 10 years. The Belt and Road Initiative has offered a fantastic way to develop infrastructure, but one of the problems with that is that if you take on debt facilities from China and you can't keep servicing that debt, then your country runs the risk of China seizing those assets and taking control of them. Now, as I mentioned earlier in today's video, Nayib Bukele has stated that he is not taking debt from China, that all of the investments so far have been pure investment to help develop the trading relationship between the two countries. And that may actually be the situation so far, because we haven't seen any major infrastructure projects. So far, El Salvador has unveiled the National Library and a new national stadium, and it will be very interesting to see whether or not any major projects are announced, such as power stations or airports or rail networks. And if they are, whether or not Nayib Bukele can stick to the concept of not taking on any debt, or if he has to sign some sort of deal similar to what other countries have signed, which would then potentially open up the risk of China taking those assets at some point in the future. But the overall summary of today's video is that Nayib Bukele's war on gangs is going well. He's continuing to take gang members off the streets and put them into prison, and that's having a really positive impact on both the economy and also the living conditions in El Salvador. It's no longer the murder capital of the world. The economics are starting to look good. The big question really is, where will El Salvador find the capital to invest into more projects? It's likely that they're going to get a lot of that capital from China, and the big question is, will it be debt or will it just be a gift? So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you did, then please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't seen the video footage of the mega prison, please watch it now because it is incredible. This is the single largest prison in the whole of the world, and it's state-of-the-art. It's been constructed in the middle of nowhere, and it's been designed to make sure that none of these gang members can escape, that none of them have any access, any communication with their former gangs, and that there will be no prison breaks, no corruption, no bribery, and everybody will see out their sentences. Now, in terms of where this prison is located, rather than the old system whereby prisons are generally located in residential areas, in fact, some old schools have been converted into prisons, what El Salvador have done here is they've purchased a huge piece of land and they have built this state-of-the-art facility in the middle of nowhere. And the reason that they've done that is to make it very difficult for any of the gangs to have any contact with anybody that's inside the prison. So in terms of a prison break, turning up to try to break somebody out and release one of the prisoners, firstly, it's remote, so it's going to be difficult to get to this prison to do that. Secondly, it's going to be more difficult to plan it. Thirdly, they'll be able to see people who are approaching the prison because there's absolutely nothing surrounding it. And fourthly, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually break in because of the facilities that they built in terms of the security fencing, all of the really thick reinforced concrete walls and everything else. So it's been designed to make it very difficult for the gangs to have any contact with the people inside. Now, in terms of the cells themselves, the way this prison has been constructed is for mass holding of prisoners. So the cells have been designed to hold lots and lots of prisoners in quadruple tier bunks. And these bunks are located very close together. So there are around about 100 bunks in every single one of these cells. So there is going to be an enormous amount of prisoners. And unfortunately for these prisoners, there are only 2 wash facilities. So these concrete squares at the front, or basically the baths that have been set up, and all the water will be controlled centrally by the guards, so the prisoners won't be able to turn on the taps and flood the area and use water to their advantage, and there are only going to be 2 toilets in every single cell. So you've got around about 100 prisoners, 2 toilets and 2 washing areas. So the facilities are fairly basic and it's going to be fairly grim. And the idea is to keep the prisoners in this cell for the vast majority of their time. And the cells have been designed to make sure that it's easy for the guards to defend, and it will be very difficult for the prisoners to actually do anything apart from just remain in the cells the whole time. Now, in terms of energy efficiency, the whole area has been set up to be very light, so they've got 2 large windows at either end, and the plan is not to have the lighting on within the cells, just have natural lighting. Now, in terms of when people do something wrong and they get sent to solitary confinement, or if they've got a gang leader, or somebody who's considered to be a dangerous prisoner, or someone who just needs to be held in solitary confinement, they built a really grim solitary confinement wing. But before we go and have a look at that, the president's just looking at all of the IT systems that have been installed. There is a lot of CCTV, a lot of surveillance equipment, so that all of the guards who are there will be able to see if anything untoward is happening, so that they can then stop that, and also to make sure that there's no intimidation, no bribery, to make it very difficult for the prisoners to actually do anything. Now, in terms of the solitary confinement wing, this is where we're going now. And as you can see, this is a large concrete structure, so it's fairly grim. It's going to be relatively cold. And the idea here is to isolate prisoners. Now, there is no electricity in this cell, so it is pitch black when the door is closed. And we've got a concrete bunk and then a wash area, so basically another concrete basin that you'll either have to wash or go to the toilet in. And when that light is off, as you can see, it is virtually pitch black in that room. When the door is closed, you won't be able to see your hand in front of your face. So this is really hardcore solitary confinement. Nothing to do, no entertainment, no computer, no mobile phone, nothing. It's literally just sitting in a dark room for the whole time until somebody comes and unlocks the door. Now, in terms of interaction with the prisoners, there is a sliding section on the front of the metal door so that the prison guard can actually look in and see what's happening within the cell, albeit it's going to be pitch black in the cell. So it'll be really difficult to actually see anything and see if anything is actually going on in there. Now, in terms of interaction with the prisoner, there is a pull-down flap so that meals can be fed through. And also when a prisoner needs to come out of this cell, they will put their hands through this flap so that they can be handcuffed before they are then taken away. And again, this is designed for security purposes to make sure that the prison guards are safe and to make it more difficult for the prisoners to do anything to attack the guards. Now, one of Nayib Bukele's objectives is to try to break the gang culture and take back control of El Salvador. And what he's trying to do is establish that concept within the prison. So he's making sure that these prisoners don't have any opportunity to be able to continue their gang discussions, to be able to control anything from inside. So he's making sure that there are no mobile phones, no form of communication, and particularly the people who are in isolation will not have any communication whatsoever with any of the prisoners. And this is very different to what was happening previously in prisons in El Salvador, where they were covered in graffiti, the gangs were running the prison, everybody had access to cell phones and computers, and were actually also being paid up to $120 per month. So they actually had cash that they could then do whatever they liked with. So all of that is changing, and this mega prison has been designed to punish the people who've been put in there and to break this gang culture, to try to stop it permeating back onto the streets of El Salvador. Now, prisoners will be given the opportunity to work in the prisons, and they've built purpose-built work areas where prisoners will be taken to and then be given specific jobs and tools and specific tasks to try to repay some of their debts. So this is the only form of entertainment that prisoners will have within the prison, is to go to work and actually do something in terms of payback. Now, in terms of the guards in these prisons, the prisoners who are going to be located here are hardcore gang members. You saw from the beginning of the video that these guys have a lot of tattoos. They've been brought up in a gang culture. So there could be potential for a lot of violence and violent activity. So the guards have been given a lot of protective equipment. This is basically riot control. So all of the guards will have helmets, they will have guns, they will have protective equipment, and they will be effectively going into a warfare situation. And all of the equipment in the mega prison is brand new. Everyone has been supplied with the latest state-of-the-art protective equipment. So you can see here that we've got a line of guards who are all in riot gear, so they're ready for action. This is how these guys will be dressed at all times in the prison. They will have helmets and guns and riot shields and anything that they need to protect themselves. And these guys will be fully trained, and a lot of these operatives are likely to have army training previously. And you can see that they're all standing to attention here to salute the president. Now, in terms of the training that these people have been given, they have been set up to break up riots. That's essentially what these prison guards expect that they're going to be doing. So they've done a lot of training and drills as to how best to handle a riot. And here's a demonstration that they're giving for the president. So you can see that these guys are coming in with their guns loaded and ready to go. So this is really aggressive in terms of the approach that they're taking. They have got all of their riot gear on, and then they're going to their predetermined areas within the prison. So each one of these teams will be deploying outside of a cell. So this assumes that a riot is going on within the cell. So they're going to have to break up that riot. And as we mentioned earlier in the video, there can be up to 100 people in each one of those cells. So if you can imagine 100 gang members who've decided that they want to start rioting, that's going to be fairly intimidating. That's going to be quite difficult to break up. They shouldn't have any weapons, but you never know. But if you look at what the riot police have got, they've got machine guns, they've got full riot gear on, they've got helmets, and there are a lot of them. So the idea is that these squads will line up outside of the cells and try to break up any riot that's going on within that cell itself. But as these cells will be locked for most of the time, the riot should be contained to individual cells, and therefore it won't be the whole prison that's rioting. And in addition to the prison guards that will be located on the ground, there will also be other prison guards who will be in elevated positions along the gangways along the top of the prison. They've also got guns, so they will be able to take action if needed. Now, one of the complaints about the prison service historically has been that the guards haven't really had any facilities whatsoever. So in this new mega prison, we've got dormitories where all of the guards will be sleeping. We've got individual washing facilities, so they've got private shower cubicles. We've got private lockers, so everybody can store all of their equipment and all of their personal items in there. But you can see that all of the prison guards will be sleeping in a mass area. So it's very similar to what you see in the army. And that's not very surprising because effectively what we've got is the army will be manning this prison. But in terms of the welfare of the prison guards, there are some entertainment facilities. So we've got some table tennis tables that have been put in. So you can have some downtime and actually play some games. And the prison guards will have access to a full gym. So all of these machines are brand new. They'll be able to come in here and exercise. These machines are not available to the prisoners. So there will be no gym. There will be no exercise equipment for the prisoners themselves. They will all be kept in their cells. All of these new facilities are for the prison guards only, not for the prisoners. And the idea behind all of this is that the prison guards will be able to maintain a healthy lifestyle and therefore be happier in their work. Now, of course, one of the other features about a prison is that you need to make it secure. You need to make it difficult for people to either break out or to break in. You don't want the gangs being able to get into the prison and extract people, or for people to get out. So the prison has been set up with 19 towers. So these are raised areas where it will be very easy to see what's going on, to see if there's any prisoners in unauthorized areas. And they will be manned at all times. And in addition to that, the prison also has electrified chain fences with 15,000 volts of electricity going through that chain fence at all times. So even if a prisoner does manage to escape from the central area and get out to one of these fences, if they try to climb that fence, they will be electrocuted by 15,000 volts. The walking areas all around the outside of the prison have all been laid with gravel to make sure that there's lots of noise, so that if prisoners are trying to escape, if they do manage to get into these areas, people will be able to hear them and it will set off the sound detection system. Now, in addition to the electrified fences, the concrete walls all around the facility are reinforced, so therefore they should be able to withstand any sort of bomb damage or bomb attack. And they're also 11 meters high, so that's around 35 feet high. So these things are going to be very difficult to scale. And then even if you did manage to scale the sheer concrete wall, it's got an electrified fence on top of that as well. So there are a lot of design features that have been built in to make it very difficult for any of these prisoners to be able to get out. So this mega prison has been designed to make it very difficult to escape from. Firstly, the prisoners are held within the cell, within the module. Secondly, the building itself that the cells are within are locked down and secure. And then once you get out of those areas, you've then got to scale the electrified fences. If you get past the electrified fences, you then have to go over the gravelled area and you meet these concrete walls, which also have electrified fences on top of them. And as well as the 19 towers that have been built all around the complex, there is also extensive CCTV and surveillance equipment. So the idea is that the guards will notice if somebody is trying to break out of this prison and therefore be able to do something about it. Now, in addition to the actual security of the building itself, outside of the prison, it's designed that there are going to be army patrols patrolling the whole of the area. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this mega prison has been set up in a remote location in the middle of nowhere. So even in the unlikely event that prisoners do get out, the army can then target all of those escapees. And the plan is to have around 600 soldiers and around 250 members of the National Civil Police on rotation protecting the area all around this prison. And all of these individuals will be armed. So the patrols will be constantly monitoring what's going on outside the prison, firstly to stop people from trying to escape out of the prison, but also to make sure that nothing's happening with regards to the gangs organising some sort of breakout, trying to do something either where they're scaling the walls or damaging the walls or digging under the walls or something of that nature. So the patrols will be constantly running around trying to stop all of that activity.